I want to talk about a whole series of issues. I was told that this would be a small group, as it is. And so one of the reasons I don't have any visual materials is that I just want to explore a bunch of issues and sort of play it a bit by ear. Basically, two subjects. One of them, which is me talking as a social scientist that I am, how do we as social scientists construct an object of study around the question of these new technologies? And I'm thinking of network technologies, interactive domains, etc. So I repeat, how do we construct an object of study that is a bit intelligent? Clearly the word intelligent has many meanings, but I mean smart. That is also a word, I guess, that has many meanings. See, we really are suffering from a shortage of terms here. Because I think social scientists have tended to construct the object of study as if the technology is the independent variable, which means it remains unexamined. It's a given. And then, and that's the second flaw, and mind you, there are two flaws in my reading. The second flaw is that it then applies to a dependent variable that is a familiar object of study for political scientists, for sociologists, for anthropologists. So at either end of that geometry, if you want, for research, there is very little homework to be done in terms of exploring new terrains. The notion that the technology itself may be constitutive of whole new objects of study falls a bit by the wayside. It may sound like I'm exaggerating, but actually I am not exaggerating. If you look at a lot of the social science literature, it does take the technology as the independent variable, and the object of study is a familiar object of study. So one of the efforts in my work, really over the last few years, has been this question of how do we construct the object of study, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. The other issue I want to talk about, and I guess it's a bit closer to what is in the title, is a question that theoretically we might posit as follows. If we have openness, as we have in network domains, you know, that are public access, and we have choice, as we have in those domains very often, do we get a more democratic outcome? And here, just to signal what I'm really going to get at, the evidence we have of the blog sphere, which has been going on for a while, and so we have sort of good evidence, is that the mix of openness and choice does not necessarily produce a more balanced distribution that we might think of as democratic. Mind you, I am playing a bit with the words here. On the contrary, what we now know is that the result is what we call a power law distribution. In other words, the winner-take-all market, the 20% of the top takes the 80% of the traffic. For me, these two issues are connected. They may not be self-evidently connected from your perspective, but the variable that connects them for me is that the reason technically given openness and technically given choice, multiple choice, does not produce a more equal distribution, does not have to do with the technology per se. It has to do with an intermediate variable, and that has to do with the social logics of users, the social utilities of the users. Hi, I know you, right? How are you? So I'm going to, this sounds, I guess, a bit abstract what I just put out to you, but I will be elaborating on the subject. So first on the question of the object of study, you know, how do we construct an object of study that can launch, if you want, new types of research agendas. I don't mean new as in everything is new, but that can expand the terrain. Mind you, I think that a lot of people who come from the technology side are doing that. The problem, I think, is a social scientist. I don't know who all is a social scientist in the room, but I think that that's where the problem comes from. A bit of history, especially since John is here, he was part of that history when the Social Science Research Council, a very good institution, I like it a lot, decided to launch a project on the new information and communication technologies. which had to do with this issue of how do we insert a new type of research agenda in the social sciences. And John was one of the people who helped us. We wanted much more from him than he had time to give us, but it made a lot of difference having him somehow connected to that project. One of the things that we did in this effort was to confine the focus on actual interactive domains. In other words, we entered electronic space rather than staying outside of it, and we tried to understand in what ways, once you are inside electronic space, you can pick up on a social logic at work that might distort the technical results that you might infer from the technology alone. Are you still with me? See, to me, for me, it's like I'm reading it all in a paper out there, but I'm hoping that I'm communicating. So, in other words, that's a certain kind of framing. If the technology can do A, B, C, D, E, and the overall project, one might say, says, it's great that it can do A, B, C, D, and then it doesn't do A, B, C, D, we can infer that there is something else at work that is altering what would be the purely technical outcome at work. Now, I applied this I sort of developed this a bit, and I applied it comparing financial markets and electronic activist networks. In finance, I'm on more secure ground because it's a more complex sort of interactive domain. I'm now talking about electronic trading, basically. And so from the perspective of finance, one simple explanation is finance is not about the technology. Finance needs that technology. Finance has been reconstituted because of that technology. Finance has scaled up, acquired different orders of magnitude because of the technology. But finance is not about the technology. The engineer's logic is not the logic of the financial trader. The financial trader's logic, in other words, what we could call the social logic, can alter the purely technical outcome. Now, in that case, and there is a history here that I want to develop, because at that point in my research life, I said, all right, here are these networks, these network domains, which function the same in the case of financial actors as they do. That sounds sort of very nice. I immediately feel, I grew up in Latin America. When I hear music, I feel like dancing immediately. I want to go out there. And so, anyhow, financial markets and electronic activists, we can put them in some place where we can say that they're using the same properties of these network technologies. They are thriving on decentralized access. Believe me, finance does. It wants to maximize the number of investors who can put their money into these markets, right? Whatever the specialized market that they're involved with. Secondly, interconnectivity. That you can move it, you can buy it, you can sell it. You're crisscrossing the world. You're not just on a one-to-one. Same thing with electronic activists. And finally, simultaneity. Now, there is always a lag. If I were a physicist, I would say, well, simultaneity, careful now. You know, it's not simultaneous, strictly speaking. You know what I'm talking about. But still, the velocity, the new temporality that gets mobilized is such that you can speak from the human eye's perspective, imperfect as it is, of simultaneity, right? So in the case of finance, that makes for an extraordinary multiplier effect. In a given amount of time, the number of transactions that can take place, and each transaction produces money, escalates incredibly when you have those three variables at work. In the case of electronic activists, again, this is a messier and fuzzier domain because you don't have the measures that you have with finance. Finance, you can actually measure it. You cannot really do that very well with electronic activists. It's much fuzzier. But in the case of electronic activists, what you get is the possibility of a sort of networked public domain that means, for me, very important, that immobile actors, people, organizations, can actually be part of it as well because of these technical properties. Now, at the time when I was working on this, here is where I was going. I was saying finance shows us something about that issue that I raised before, that power law distributions can happen out of those technical conditions. In principle, when you have decentralized access, interconnectivity, and simultaneity, you should have very nicely distributed outcomes. In the case of electronic activists, so my fantasy went, you can have a more democratic setting. In the case of finance, in principle, what it ought to have meant, and that turned out to be a counterfactual, of course, was that capital gets distributed where it really gets needed. You know, there is an evenness in the distribution. Slightly less romantic version of that would be that all kinds of little financial centers are going to get a good piece of the global capital pie now, much better than before. Well, I measured, you know, the 60s, the 70s, when it really starts going is the 80s, when you begin to have the emergence of a global market as opposed to an international market, very different. 90s, 2000, and we're still counting. Growing concentration, or the same level of concentration as before. So I stood back and I said, you know what, here what we have is a situation where all these technologies with all their properties produce an outcome that is not necessarily more democratic. It's actually exactly the same outcome, only different orders of magnitude, different temporal frames, different numbers of participants, et cetera, et cetera. Then I looked at the electronic activists, and I didn't have, you know, just very difficult to measure. I couldn't quite tell whether there was more or less, say, distributed democratic outcome. Let's just use the substantive term here. But it seemed to me that what you did not have was this increased concentration that you saw in finance. So coming back to the methodological question, or also the theoretical question in a way, it told me that finance, the logic of financial users, is such that while it uses the technical properties, it actually also distorts what might be the engineer's design for those technologies, distributed outcomes. Phase two, with this has happened, all kinds of things have happened around civil society. Civil society actors have been given a chance to use these technologies, to analyze how you can best use them, all of these things. The last meeting, I'm assuming some of you were there, a truth emerged. A truth which in the case of finance was evident, I would argue, already 10 years ago, which in the case of civil society was not as evident. It was more difficult to track it. And the truth is that for one reason or another, yes, there were more participants at the table, but that kind of distributive outcome, the democratizing of part of the political zone, did not quite happen. There were a lot of complaints. Very well-intentioned civil society organizations were amazed at how little really was achieved. There were a lot of very good people there, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to paint a very positive picture. That then brings up a second, to me, important heuristic moment in this attempt to understand the interaction of the technical properties with the social logics of users. And here I go back to the example that I started out with, the block sphere, because it is a very helpful example to get at some of these things and raise the question, openness of access and many choices, which is what civil society sort of was offering. The outcome didn't quite go in the direction of more democratization. What is going on? What is happening here? And then here again, you are at a point, and that is why I think that the last 2 or 3 years of what has happened with civil society organizations are actually very interesting, because it was history in the making, and it produced evidence, if you want. That before, I would say 10 years ago, when I was starting with finance on this, well, I started actually 15 years ago, we didn't have that kind of evidence on the civil society sphere. I would say now we have it. So the question then becomes, what are the ways in which the technical properties that could deliver a more distributed outcome, a more democratic outcome, an outcome marked by genuine substantive distributed political participation. What happens with those technical properties in terms of the social logics of the users in civil society? Now, the reason that sort of raises the ante of the question is that finance is not in the business of democratizing. It just really isn't. Yes, the market of capital is meant to distribute capital where it's most needed and where it can be most efficiently used, but we all know that that comes with a lot of baggage, and the baggage really takes it in another direction. Civil society organizations, many of them are in the business of democratizing, of redistributing, of achieving certain, let us just take them at their word. Let's not go in there and say, oh, well, it isn't really that way. Well, let's just assume. So what is it that happens with civil society organizations that keeps them from producing an outcome that you might expect them to produce? And here we get to this proposition of openness. Everybody can participate in principle, and multiple choice, and why it does not deliver the outcome that you might expect. And again, the case of the blog, let me just elaborate that a bit, because that is one of the tightest bits of evidence that we have on this. Because the blogs are in the business of being open access. You have now a lot of blogs to choose from. They want to be found and entered and visited, etc., right? I mean, open doesn't begin to capture that, right? We have had several years of history now of this, so we have data. And it's actually very, very simple. But the notion is that the technical format that is offered by the blog sphere does not necessarily deliver a parallel, an isomorphic political format. And so at that point, I say, coming back to our project that I was describing with the SSRC, we're at that point able to capture again something about the endogenizing of a social logic into the electronic field. And the engineer's design is then altered. Whatever the engineer might have had in mind, it's thwarted, for good or for bad. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying that it doesn't go that way. Now, what happens in the blog sphere, which is a very particular one? As we know, at the top of the data show this, at the top of the popularity list are a bunch of blogs that get a lot of the traffic. The number of people who are accessing blogs is growing rapidly. The numbers of blogs are also growing, but the number of people evidently is growing faster. Why do the top blogs get so much traffic? And at the lower end, evidently, it's just a few people who sort of interact with each other. And, I mean, you can just see it, and here it becomes really a sociology. You don't have time, so you want to make sure that you go to the blogs that your friends also go to. If you're going to spend time trying to read the alternative press, so to speak, of the blog sphere, you're going to go to those that everybody else is also reading. This has nothing to do with the technology. This has everything to do with social logics of users. So one interpretation, which I find very compelling, I mean, I think that this is that what we call the blog sphere, and this I see a lot when I look at these domains, it's a variable. At the top of the system, it's pretty close to being conventional media, because the people who run those blogs are simply no longer able to respond to all the queries that they're getting. And pretty soon they're going to just be, choosing maybe a few that gets probably letters to the editor, and they're basically just letting people read what they say, and then a few chosen letters. At this end, with this very little traffic, it's going to be like a conversation. Not quite the idea of the blog. They will get to know each other. They will rehearse the same arguments and disagreements and agreements. And it's really in the middle of the variable that you have that thing that we now think of as the blog sphere, where the particularities of the technology and the particularities of the social logics of users constitute a specific domain. In that middle zone, this question of openness of access and choice of where you're going to go to, producing a power law distribution is going to be very, very clear. Now, to me, there is a really interesting sort of move between looking at finance, not in the business of democratizing, and looking at civil society organizations, a bit in the business of democratizing, and that both are showing us that the technical formats of these networks, when we're dealing with interactive domains, where there are people, or people who represent, organizations or whatever, as opposed to, say, data pipelines, which is another kind of thing. But when we're dealing with these interactive domains, the technical formats of networks cannot be necessarily be expected to produce distributed outcomes. That, in fact, returning to civil society organizations, returning to the question of power, democracy, politics, etc., we have to invent new political formats if we're going to make the technologies deliver the goods that they in principle could deliver. So this is not a critique of the technology per se. This is actually a critique that if the technology can deliver X, Y, and Z, that we simply rest back, sit back, and say, oh my God, well, there it comes. If we just have the right nice organizations as opposed to the nasty financial types doing the work, we're all settled. No, we aren't. Because evidently, and this is to me, this is my language, and I don't know that it communicates, the technical domain, the interactive space, endogenizes certain social logics, and they do distort the outcomes. Distort here is now speaking from the perspective of the engineer's design. So the task at hand, besides the question of continuously developing the technical capabilities and the features, etc., the task also becomes to use a certain kind of language to develop new political formats through which to use these technologies. Now, let me just elaborate a bit on the question of civil society organizations, since that is also sort of embedded a bit in the title that those who invited me, Kazis, I think, chose for the talk. Why is it that civil society organizations are not quite managing to extract what they could extract from these technologies, given that their objectives are to raise the participation, to raise, the distributive effect, if you want? And there is some really interesting emergent research on this. And again, we're talking about a history that is making itself right now. The Tunis meeting was very important to again mark what was dimly evident in the Geneva meeting, and now there is no more doubt that the political format of these civil society organizations is not working the way it ought to work. So let me just excavate a bit, dig into that point a bit. And again, this is partly interpretive. I'm now referring to research that has been done by others, but I find it very persuasive. The notion is that civil society organizations have been placed, these kinds of civil society organizations that sit around the table, if you want, in these meetings. It's a certain kind of organization. These civil society organizations have been situated in a particular kind of place. And it is a place that has been shaped by our conventional, if you want, liberal democracy would be a big word to use, but we can use it. So there are all kinds of constraints that they're subject to. For starters, questions of the funding, the relationship with funders, the relationship with governments, the accountability measures. They have a lot of rules of accountability with the accounting and the this and the. So they are completely bogged down by an apparatus that is a straight import from, mainstream society. In there, then, in that evidence, lies a possibility for an explanation and a programmatics. The explanation is that that kind of formatting of network-based, and centered and users, civil society organizations, is very disruptive. for the project of civil society organizations who want to really maximize the utilities that they can derive from these technologies, right? And that, in fact, while it looks like they are more democratic, there's a lot of critique, as you know, on these organizations that they're not really democratic, et cetera, that they become more democratic, more accountable, they fit into that. It actually hijacks their genuine democratic project into a zone that is very unattractive. This is very difficult for many people to digest. The notion that if you democratize the organization in the conventional sense of the term, that you actually keep that organization from being as democratic in the substantive sense of the term as they could be. And I am not sure that you're still with me. But that is, in a way, the problematic. And in that sense, I stand back and I say, well, the multinationals, which have existed for a very long time, when they decided that they wanted to go global, they had to do a lot of work. They had to do a lot of innovating. We have no such legal persona as a global firm. I'm sure you know that. It doesn't exist. What we do have is a global space that has been constructed that is the result of a lot of innovation, very creative accountants, very creative legal types, et cetera, very creative technological contributions. So what we have is a space that is the product of innovations that makes it possible for firms that have been multinationals for a very long time to also be global, which is different, all right? It's a different way of functioning. A lot of innovating, and I could just give you many, many other examples along those lines. Why would civil society organizations not have to innovate? And this innovating is often brutal in terms of existing cultures, brutal in terms of existing arrangements and collaborations. The Ford Foundation, the nanny, in England we talk about the state as a nanny state. I think that's for civil society organizations in this country. The Ford Foundation is the nanny. I don't know, I'm hoping that nobody is here from the Ford Foundation. Mind you, I have to thank them for a lot of funding on this one particular project. So they funded my dissertation research, etc., though I decided to use the money to set up a daycare center for migrant workers' children. I thought that was more useful, and I thought the Ford Foundation would appreciate that, given they did not. But anyhow, that is really way past in the... But the point... Oh, I realize this is being videotaped, so it might go back there. But no, that's okay. They know. They have heard me say this. But designing new political formats so that, and this is for this audience, because in a different audience one might say that the purpose would be who knows what, so that these organizations can actually derive the democratic payload that they are after, maximizing participation, maximizing distribution, et cetera, that designing that kind of political format will be quite destructive of a lot of the cozy relationships that they have now with governments and with foundations, very well-intentioned foundations, mind you. That leaves one at a very peculiar juncture. Now, I stand back then and I look at finance. Now, finance is very innovative, very vanguard, and very brutal. Finance is not about money. People think that finance is about money. Finance is not about money. Banking is about money. Finance is a capability to liquefy what we thought was not liquefiable. But it's really, it should not be thought of as money. Finance represents a radical and brutal innovation, compared to banking, for instance. Enormously destructive, enormously powerful. It has found, in many ways, a format that allows it to derive enormous utilities from the new technologies at a huge price to a lot of people, including people and firms inside finance. There is something really brutal. It's like building the railroads on the West or laying down fiber optic cable, running through Malaysia where they had to, sneak over the border and, all the stories, right? I'm still waiting for the dissertation that will be called Laying Fiber Optic Cable, around the world, because that's an extraordinary. So, there is finances like that too. We don't think of finance that way. But it has that sort of, Well, it seems to me let me just leave you with this sort of a final provocative radical thought, that if we're going to design the political formats that allow civil society organizations to really maximize the utilities that they can derive from these technologies, it's going to take a lot of creative destruction of existing arrangements. Because right now, on the one hand, the social logics that I was describing as illustrated by the case of the blogosphere, and on the other hand, these issues of the formats within which they are forced, the kinds of relationships that they have to have with governments and with foundations. Very problematic. I am not saying, I have my own thoughts about it, but I'm not saying whether I think that it is worth to do that. That's another subject. But I'm just saying, as an observer, as a researcher on this, it seems to me that all the complaining and hand-wringing about how come that it's been such a failure, first Geneva, then WSIS, you know, and that it somehow doesn't seem to, that we need to really understand what the dynamics are at work, what the limitations are. For me, who started out thinking that, oh, in finance, we get one outcome, in electronic activists, we can get a different kind of outcome. You know, I also wind up in a place where I'm saying, well, you know, it's going to be far more difficult, actually, than we thought. Finally, as a social scientist, I do find it extremely interesting to look at this, you know, if you want, not a war, but a tension, a conflict that is built into, it's not a conflict of objectives, it's a conflict that is built into the capabilities of two logics, the technical logic and the social logic of users. That intersection, that is an embedded tension, evidently. We now know that. We didn't really, I don't think we had that clarity even a few years ago, because we needed natural experiments in a way. But it seems to me that that tension is a very interesting one that deserves a lot of research. And we sort of have to really lose our innocence in terms of both sides of the equation, the social logics and the technical logics. Back to finance. It seems to me that when I look at finance, it has succeeded in making that tension work for its objectives. And let me just give you a few little figures. When you look at the escalation in the orders of magnitude of finance, you know, everything has grown. Global trade has grown. Global foreign direct investment has grown. You know, 11 trillion last year for more or less each one of those. Those are huge amounts. Well, finance, the latest figures, if you take traded derivatives as the indicator, which is most of the financial markets really operate on a whole variety of derivatives. I mean, there are many, many different kinds. It was, according to the Bank for International Settlements, and they should know, it was almost 300 trillion. It was 292 trillion. Now, you know that you're dealing with different orders of magnitude here. This is not just simply more money. There is between the 11 trillion of global trade, the 11 trillion of foreign, it's more like 9 trillion of foreign direct investment stock, and finance, you know that you're not talking about the same, it's not the same measure. And I think that it's a real problem that we are still confined to money as some sort of neutral variable through which we then measure global trade and direct foreign investment and finance. Finance, we could say, I would say, but not everybody needs to agree with that, that order of magnitude that finance has achieved, given that that is one of its objectives. And that order of magnitude is made. That doesn't fall from the sky. So it is precisely that technical infrastructure that it has used. The digitizing of financial instruments has meant that you can have all kinds of users who don't know either the algorithms or the math. They can use it. That's a brilliant innovation, actually, that you can software these instruments. So when I stand back and I look at finance, I take as an indicator the order of magnitude that it has achieved. I say, and all kinds of other things, mind you. It's the financializing of economic criteria is another issue. You know, there are several indicators here. I say, my God, finance has managed to make that tension, that embedded tension of the social logic of the user, again, I repeat, finance is not about the technology. Finance uses that technology. And the technical properties, let's say the engineer's logic or whatever. Finance has known how to make that tension work. Civil society organizations have not. It's a tool. It's a little tool that they can use. But I think we're still a long, long way. Finance succeeded at huge costs. For finance to be what it became, you know, starting in this new phase, finance has had such phases before. This is not the first time, but this is certainly one that starts in the 80s. Vast amount of stuff was destroyed. There were many situations where Wall Street, you know, was merging and doing the mergers between big firms. Then time two, you know, like a few years later, the two firms that had been merged were finished, and the Wall Street firm that had done the deal came out triumphant with huge profits. Goldman Sachs, do people know what Goldman Sachs profits were last? Well, revenues, that's different actually, but it was 2.6 billion, many zeros in there. So I stand back and I say, you know, finance has known how to do it, but by God, it was at a huge cost, including to finance, but certain aspects of finance. So that leaves me with sort of a question, and here again I speak as a researcher, as a theorist, not as a practical advisor to civil society organizations. I'm not trying to be, you know, an advisor now, but it does pose a question. It does pose a question and say, how and why would civil society organizations actually try to do the hard work of remaking political formats in order to achieve their objectives? And then now I speak as an individual, independent individual, and I say, well, I look, this is in my new book I worked on for 8 years on a whole bunch of these kinds of issues, but I look back, and one thing that strikes me is that the formal political apparatus today accommodates less and less of the political. You know, the Germans have the best word, das Politische. It's sort of an abstract notion. It's not the political system. It's not the formal electoral system. It's the political, right? And all kinds of other vocabularies and actors and subjectivities are getting created, often cultural, circus, parades, all kinds of things that are, in a way, taking up some of the space. It's the sphere of informal politics. Not informal because it's illegal, but informal because it's not running through formalized apparatuses. It seems to me that there's a whole agenda there. And so I stand back as an individual and I say, it would really be nice if some of these civil society organizations could do the hard work of making new political formats, even if it means that the Ford Foundation is not going to fund their next project. I think it's on the agenda. It's going to be difficult. But I think there is a project afoot, it seems to me, which I theoretically might say is centered on the tension, that point of intersection between these two logics, a technical logic and a social logic of the users, that needs to be worked on in the case of civil society organizations. And that there is a kind of, to me, it would seem very exciting and very productive of possibilities, very difficult. But I think that inevitably, I'm sure there are already people who are doing it, it's there. It's out there to work on. And again, finance represents an instance where it has been done with enormous resources, with enormous motivations, given the results. And so that is, I think I would just like to leave you with that thought. And I thank you very much for your attention.